marathon session.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. And now we'll begin the roundtable session under the theme Wellbeing and Inclusive Growth as Business Objectives. And as I just mentioned, Dr. Rutger Hoekstra, Scientific Director of KPMG, will serve as the moderator for this session. And we have a couple of our speakers here as well. Please take your seats so that we can start the roundtable session. And now please welcome our moderator and our speakers with a big round of applause.
Welcome everyone to this session on business and well-being. I think today we've already heard a lot about the relationship between business and well-being, but I think we have a really excellent panel today, and I'm looking forward to introducing them to you. But first I want to set the scene. I think we've heard already a lot about how business really affects well-being, but I just want to take a step back and reflect on the 2 days. I think one of the things that we've really heard in terms of general megatrends, I think we've heard things like globalization, digitization, aging economy, climate change, biodiversity loss, all tremendous challenges basically to society. And I think our notion of how to solve these problems has changed over time, and especially the relationship between, for example, governments and business. Now, just in the previous conversation, we had this conversation about the Anglo-Saxon model, whereby basically the government is as small as possible, but it does set regulations, it does set sort of a level playing field, and as Milton Friedman would say, basically the company is only there to maximize profits. And I think actually that model, I think if you look around, has really changed quite dramatically. I think this is no longer the case, that society is expecting actually more from business, and it might be due to the financial crisis, it might be due to climate change, it might be due to tax issues, it might be CEO payments, but society, I think in general, is really reflecting on the role of companies and expecting more. And I also think actually companies are responding to that request. I think there are many examples, and I think we'll discuss quite a few today, where companies are actually also responding to this need. And the question, I think, from the previous section was very much, are they doing this out of charity? Do they want to create a better world? Well, I think, as you alluded to, it's actually also a matter of good business sense. The old model of basically improving shareholder value was very much a short-term narrative, and now there is this focus on long-term value creation. So actually looking at your company from a longer time horizon, and then it makes a lot of sense to actually look at these mega trends, because all these mega trends will also be affecting your business. So I think also Secretary General Gurria also stressed this when he said that when the Better Life Initiative started, it started with governments, then it went to the mayors, and now at this conference, I think quite excitingly, for the first time, I think we really have business at the table. This also leads me to a bit of a personal introduction. My name is Rutger Hoekstra. I'm from KPMG Sustainability, so I'm actually now helping corporations, but I actually used to be at these conferences of the OECD as a statistician. So I believe a lot of people in the audience are statisticians, and I've worked at the Statistical Office of the Netherlands for a long time on measuring sustainable development in the Netherlands. I was also the co-chair of a task force of the OECD on measuring sustainable development. And I've just completed a book as well, which is called Replacing GDP by 2030, which will be out in May. And so I've also made this change basically to the corporations. And what did KPMG say to me when I shifted? They said, you know, the amount of knowledge that is needed to sort of advise companies is increasing manyfold. And a lot of the things that we learn actually at the national level about measuring sustainable development are actually really useful at the company level. So things like supply chains, transitions, these kind of things are definitely necessary. So that's just a personal introduction. Now I just want to say one last thing, and that is that how are companies responding to this new role that they have, or this increased role? Well, I think it is important to say that there are some companies that are not responding at all. They, I think, will be continuing on the old model of shareholder value. You know, it's quite easy when we're in a well-being bubble to think that all companies are doing good, but I don't think this is actually, of course, the case. And it would be rather naive to actually think of it in that way. But there are companies, of course, doing these things, and I think the largest group is actually companies that are reporting. So KPMG does a survey every year of the amount of big companies actually reporting on CSR. And I think now at this time of the global 250 largest companies, 80% are actually reporting on their corporate social responsibility. But with reporting, you always get a bit of a queasy feeling about, you know, whether, is it just a marketing trick? Is it just to, you know, just to be greenwash, for example, just to give a positive message? And there are ways in which this sector is professionalizing. So nowadays there's also assurance actually of these reports. But there is a second issue as well, and that is that even if the numbers are correct, what do they say? And what decisions are you making? And I think that's the third category of companies which is actually quite small at the moment, that are actually using this information to actually make better decisions. And I think that links really well to the topic of our conference, that you have statistics, you have the data on companies, that leads to knowledge about what your organization is doing. But most important, perhaps, is the last step, making a better decision for your company or for your country. I think we've had some excellent sessions on the company perspective, but I must say I can still think of many questions to ask our panel, luckily. So I'd just briefly like to introduce everybody. You all know Malin Ripa from the previous session. She's the head of corporate responsibility. It wasn't mentioned in previous sessions, but it's actually Volvo Trucks especially, and Volvo Cars is actually a different company as far as I understand, right?
That's correct.
Then Yong-Kyung Soo, she is a director at the Sustainable Growth Initiative here in South Korea. Pierre Habar, who is the Secretary General of the Trade Union Advisory Committee. Rudolph Durand, Rudy apparently I can call you, Professor of Purposeful Leadership and founder of Society and Organizations. Maryse Roberts, Director at the Organization of American States, and Asako Nagai, Director of Business for Sustainable Responsibility in Japan. So please welcome the panelists with a round of applause. And please also add your questions as soon as possible. I, of course, have quite a few questions prepared, but I would actually prefer to open the floor also to questions that you have, and my iPad is over here. So just to start off, just to set the scene, I'd like to ask Asako, you represent an organization with a huge network of companies. Are there certain trends in terms of companies, going into well-being and sustainability, which you would like to share with us today?
Thank you. This is Asako Nagai. I work for an organization called BSR. Our headquarters is based in San Francisco, United States. We're a nonprofit organization. We also have an office in New York, Paris, Copenhagen, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Guangzhou, Tokyo. We work with about 250 multinational companies, which sort of represent 500 companies globally. And what we do is basically work with the corporation business community to address the sustainability issues. That's what we basically do. But how we do that is there's a 4 major component to that. One is helping the big company, multinational company at the headquarter level, trying to help them understand these changes and transition, what sort of transition they need to make to survive through these processes at the headquarter level. But at the same time, we also work together with those companies through the supply chain, as we know that those companies have their footprint in many of the different countries outside of their mother countries, in countries like Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Malaysia, African continent, whichever developing countries where they're sourcing or they have their manufacturing suppliers, including many of the multiple different situations, including labor and human rights issues at the field level, whether it could be palm oil plantation in Malaysia, or rubber plantation in Indonesia, or coffee plantation in some African countries. That's what we do. So I guess throughout these processes of working with corporation, help understanding and also trying to help them making this transition to change their traditional behavior and model of how it had worked before. Companies are increasingly starting to understand very rapidly, because the world is changing so rapidly today. And I have been in this sustainability field for 20 years, and the change is becoming so fast every year. I'm so stunned about this. And the major changes could be caused by the globalization or internet, technology. So in the past, you never know where your shoe come from or your food come from, but now you know how and what they're doing when they're making your shoes in the process of it. So a lot of things has changed and forced to change the corporate behavior in the past 20 years is what I see. And I guess their major changes is what we see. One is the major changes in the rules and guidelines. It started with the disclosures or transparency, increasingly guidelines like what we said, Global Reporting Initiative, or it could be SASB, or it could be integrated reporting. So the multiple stakeholders are requesting increasing disclosure and become more transparent. And a lot of regulation came into place, including some of the non-financial disclosures in the EU. So that's one thing, is a major pressure. But I think what we most see, the most important changes we see is the stakeholder dynamics surrounding the companies, which sort of make major changes. In the past, that the state has been one of the very strong regulator for the corporation. Now today we see a bit of a differences in changing that power dynamics, that the corporation has the big sales or impact to the society, even bigger than many of these countries' GDPs today. So that's the impact that the individual corporation can have to the society. And talking about stakeholder dynamics, I think the civil societies, NGOs has been becoming more vocal because of the increasing issues and challenges, including more inequalities we've seen in the past years. Inequalities actually, I think, increasing in many countries, including the United States, for example, but globally in many different countries as well. So that triggers civil societies, and also the investor as becoming a very strong power to make the corporate behavior change by changing the investment decisions based on social responsible manner. That's the stakeholder dynamics that we see.
Thank you very much. So there's a lot of these companies involved on this journey, looking especially at these stakeholders. And I'd like to bring in Rudolf, you here. Sometimes it's argued that if companies are not doing anything about well-being or sustainability, they will be amongst the losers, basically, of the future. And I know you do a lot of work on the evolution of companies, which companies are successful, which are not. And one of the classics which is sometimes used is Kodak, which of course thought that the digital camera would never really take off, and they chose wrong. And sometimes people, I think it's also in the book by Kate Rayworth, Donut Economics, sometimes people say, you know, if companies ignore basically sustainability and well-being in this day and age, they will become the Kodaks of the future. Could you confirm this, or is this perhaps a naive view, and maybe it's actually the companies that are focusing on short-term profits that will be the winners in 20 years' time?
Thank you very much. So I'm very happy to be here. This question rings a bell, of course. So I'm Rudolf Duran. I think we didn't mention, actually, I'm a business school professor. So that means that I'm training, not just me, but with my colleagues, I'm training the new generation, or I've been training the generations of general managers that actually run these companies. And I'm a business school professor, and I'm a strategy professor. So that means that the dependent variable that we look at, so that means what we want to explain, is a competitive advantage of firms. So hence, if I reformulate the question, this question is, can well-being be a source of competitive advantage for firms? And so I think that this was well said before. Not all of the companies actually are engaged in this type of policies. But the academic results show clearly that over the last 20 years, the firms that engaged in these strategies, meaning developing programs to cater to their stakeholder needs, developing programs, and I think that actually, Malin, you mentioned it as well for Volvo, take care of their employees, clearly have a superior performance. So this can be shown in various manners, and I will give you just 3 figures. Customers are willing actually to pay a little bit more for same quality products depending on the firm's policies. So it's about 3% more for firms which are engaged in this type of policies. It's not just that, it's also that the productivity of these firms is superior by about 6 to 8, even 10% in some cases when you compare 2 matched samples of firms, equal size, same industry, etc. And the innovation rate is even better in the firms that are geared toward developing a sustainable environment and taking care of their employees. So I think that progressively these data and these results show up, and that more and more managers and the people we have in our business school, tend to learn about this and realize that actually there is probably different business models that can be developed. I think that Danone case that we had before is also exemplary of the way through different types of governance systems, ecosystem fund, or some other, for some other companies would be foundations. You can learn how just to develop these new business models. So in a nutshell, I think that, yes, the firms which are today deeply involved in considering these different dimensions are at and will be at a competitive advantage when we will hit the wall, because we are all moving toward hitting the wall in terms of access to natural resources, water treatment, air pollution and contamination, and you can name it. So that means that these firms have an advantage today and will get it for tomorrow.
And so these are actually comparisons to this Anglo-Saxon notion of sort of shareholder maximization?
Well, I will not make this distinction, because in the Anglo-Saxon world, you also have companies that develop these type of programs. You also have the appearance of different types of actually legal statuses, such as public benefit corporation in the US, entreprise à mission in France, benefita corporation in Italy, and etc. So you have other type of statuses that enable to escape for the general managers and the executives some of these fiduciary duty that is in place in some countries, especially the Anglo-Saxon countries. This said, we still have the problem of the commensurability between, so meaning the comparability between the different indicators that are produced by consulting firms, raters, accreditation agencies, and you name it, which means that when you take different type of raters or evaluators, or if you take the environmental reports or the social impact reports, they are not easily comparable across evaluators. This is a big problem. And so for the last 10 years, I was really thinking that actually the truth was lying in the companies' decisions, rational decisions to invest in these different programs, improve the well-being of their employees, develop the sustainability and their ecosystems. By ecosystem, I mean the ecological systems in which their suppliers operate, etc. But the more I think about this situation, the more I see that actually probably the inertia in the largest firm is actually superior to the willingness of their general managers to actually really change the things. Hence, just not to be too long and to conclude on this point, I'm thinking more and more that actually, because we are hitting this wall of the natural resources, limitations of the increase of energy prices for some industries, the salvation could come not from the producers themselves, meaning the organizations, the firms, but from the investors. Today, the sustainable investment or social impact investment is still relatively low, a fraction of the total, the $1,200 trillion dollars which are exchanged every day. But I think that progressively the investors will go hand in hand with some of the evaluators actually to have some metrics. And as much as in the 60s, the statisticians, I mean, your predecessors, actually had difficulties coming up with the good indicators to create the GDP, well, I think that in 20 years from now, actually we would have indicators of well-being that will be imperfect, but that they will be used globally to evaluate the firms. And this will be in the Bloomberg screens as a key notion for investing in some companies that do good or don't do good.
Yeah. So in these Bloomberg terminals will definitely be the figures for, I think, the big corporates. Is something that is sometimes forgotten, is something that I would like to ask you, Maurice, about, is actually the role of SMEs. I know that your organization actually works a lot on SMEs, and I'd like to know sort of course, the role of SMEs in the economy are well understood, and I think also a part of a lot of research and policy. But specifically, perhaps, how does the development of SMEs influence well-being?
Yeah, thank you. I work for the Organization of American States, which is an intergovernmental organization that brings together all the sovereign states of the Americas. So in that context of the OAS, we have a number of ministerial processes, one of which brings together the ministers responsible for SMEs. At those ministerial and in similar meetings, what countries do is to share experiences, programs that work in the context of SMEs. They have shared in the past 10 years with each other their experience with assisting SMEs. Let me give you a little bit of context, and I will focus on Latin America and the Caribbean here. As in many other regions, SMEs account for 99% of all firms, approximately 75% of all jobs, but 30% of the GDP, which means that there's a significant issue with productivity. So ministers and the ecosystem in the last 5-6 years have focused on what are the constraints, what are the obstacles, how can we help those small units do better? One constraint has to do with access to capital. Of course, a number of novel instruments have been created, but that's not enough. So countries, a number of countries, I would say about 20 in Latin America and the Caribbean, have over the past 6 or 7 years established what we call small business development centers, places where a small entrepreneur can go and get advice. Now, it's not a one-shot deal. Actually, those centers, and we at the OAS have helped with funding from the US government, establish some of those centers in the Caribbean. So it's a place where a small entrepreneur, a micro-entrepreneur, maybe even someone who works in the informal sector can go, get advice, and those advisors actually are creating a relationship with the entrepreneur or the would-be entrepreneur. And in order to actually, and this, as we have seen over the past few years, that the results are quite interesting. The matrix there, it's not so much on the well-being yet, although there are aspects of that. It's more about the number of jobs created, sales, and so on and so forth. However, if you think of well-being, you think of these people having, the entrepreneurs, trust in the advisor with the relationship that is long-term, one-on-one. And of course, there are also courses or specific targeted training for those entrepreneurs that may wish to get, be trained in one or several aspects of their sectors. So, because another issue that we face in Latin America and the Caribbean is that it's not just there, but the skills gap, both at the level of the employees and at the level of the employers in the SME sector. So in terms of, if you look at the data that we have, approximately half of the employers have a high school degree, no? Some have a tertiary education, but not much more. If you compare with OECD, this is much, much less. So they need new skills. So these centers who actually, where they are established in communities in the different parts of a country, not just in the capital, they actually are there to help, to assist the SMEs. What we have seen also is that the world is changing. This week we heard, yesterday I think, the UN report on climate change. And now in the Americas, a year ago, some of you may remember, there were severe hurricanes that wiped out some countries in the Caribbean and also affected population also in the United States. But some small islands of the Caribbean really, like a small island of Dominica, the losses were such as they accounted for 200% of GDP. So another issue that has come up where ministers and other authorities, governmental authorities working with SMEs have done in this past year is like, what can we do to assist those SMEs before there is a hurricane or another natural disaster? So the issue of business continuity, what do you do? Because when a hurricane hits you, it's not just your enterprise, it might be your home, might be your family, certainly your employees, also their family. So, and of course, right after the hurricane, you may get a number of foreigners coming to help you. So how do these SMEs actually prepare for those disasters? Because this is something that's going to happen again. So what I wanted to highlight here is the fact that we have to be very, and policymakers also, very agile in terms of adapting to the new needs of those, in the case of SMEs, those new economic units that they account for the bulk of the productive sector in that particular region. So one has to take into account what they do, who they are, and how to help them get better, more productive. And being productive and being Malin, you said in the previous session, you said well-being is connected to productivity, defined broadly, obviously. So ministers have not yet used the concept or the framework of well-being, but in many ways they are borrowing, I would say, from the spirit of well-being to actually assist those small enterprises.
What is also interesting about SMEs, of course, is that they skip the reporting part completely and go straight to action, basically. And I think you do say that, 75% of the jobs, the training, so they have an important role to play, I think, in the well-being in that sense. And also this agility to adapt to the questions being asked, I think, is very important. Pierre, I'd like to bring you into the conversation. One of the things that the OECD has been tracking really well is globalization. They have this project on trade in value added, where you can really see clearly that globalization has been taking place from around 1990. And this has caused huge fragmentation of the production process. And it also means that, in a sense, it's very difficult actually to track who is actually making the product because there are so many suppliers. And from a trade union perspective, I think this, of course, leads to all types of issues. And I'm very curious to hear, how do you deal with it? What is your perspective, actually, on supply chain transparency and worker conditions in these supply chains?
No, absolutely. Thank you, Rutger. And I must say, perhaps, well-being, that's the business of unions. That's our job, the well-being of workers. Our mission is to negotiate good wages with employers, but also good pensions, good health care, to negotiate good occupational health and safety standards, and indeed also to negotiate on behalf of workers good work-life balance. The problem, as you mentioned, is that with globalization and this new round of globalization that we're experiencing with digitalization, is that unfortunately, as far as my constituency is concerned, the trade unions, we've had to lower our ambition. Today, we are less talking about reaching the well-being of workers. We are more about securing the basics, ensuring that ensuring that we have some shared prosperity, that the enormous wealth created by business, by company, are indeed shared more or less in a fair way between all the stakeholders, and also perhaps ensure that business do indeed address impacts, adverse impact. That's a general principle of do no harm, okay? That doesn't mean that we don't necessarily want to engage a conversation, and we do, on work-life balance and on the future of work, on how we anticipate on the future skill needs. But for good, unfortunately, we still have to secure the basics. Yesterday, I met with the two trade union leaders here in Korea, the leaders of the KCTU and the FKTU, and they said, well, yes, South Korea is a winner of globalization. You have great brands, big companies, no question about that. The question is it shared equitably within the supply chain? And they told me, well, right now we have two big things on the agenda. One is secure core labor standards here in Korea, and the second big topic is working time. Here in Korea, the working time limit is at 52 hours a week. I mean, I'm European. I tell you, 52 hours a week, that's a lot. So, moving ahead, on our side, we'll see there are perhaps two big challenges. And if I may, I'll simply, just all what Professor Stiglitz said in the previous sessions, we buy it. And on the labor side, that's a given. So that will make my life much easier. I'll just bring two, perhaps, barriers or challenges ahead. One is that, and this is not to demonize big business, but there is a problem of trust with big business, with large multinational enterprises, on two grounds. One is, as I mentioned, is that we are not sure that the enormous wealth created by business is shared equitably. I mean, there is billions of money that is wasted in share buybacks, in shareholder dividend. And I'm not, I don't want to stigmatize one model versus versus another. There is no good European Rhineland one versus a bad Anglo-American one. It just factually, today, large businesses are wasting a lot of money on short-termist remuneration for a given stakeholder, which is shareholders. And at the same time, and that's both at firm level, but also macro level, and there you have the evidence with the OECD, is that prior to the crisis 10 years ago, but even before that, we observe a clear decoupling between wage and productivity. Practically, that means that workers are not having their fair share of the wealth that they contribute to the firm. In the current recovery today, wages are flat. So that really brings me to one point you mentioned, Roda. We need to have a long-term vision. I don't want here to fall into what we call in French misérabilisme, but for the people that I represent, the constituency that I represent, they can't afford to be long-term. With wage being compressed in many countries, including in Korea, South Korea, but in France and everywhere, they simply, they can only afford to be short-termists and think about trying to have end meet at the end of the month. So trust. The second barrier is what you mentioned is fragmentation of businesses. I saw recently a chart of an airline company. And that was not like a low-cost company. It was a classic continental European airline company. And it was amazing because this was a chart where actually you saw the structure of the company. It was not one single entity. It was a magma of entities. The flight attendants were employed by this company. All the goodies, the intangible, the brand was in another holding company. Another entity was employing the pilot and so on and so forth. The issue right now is that, frankly, we don't know where the perimeter of responsibility of a company ends because of fragmentation, because of outsourcing. I'm not even saying whether it's good or bad. I'm just saying, where does a company responsibility end? We made the figures, for example, to bring a case of here in Korea of Samsung. Samsung, great products, we know it, successful company. Officially, they employ 450,000 employees. That's within the perimeter, the official perimeter of Samsung. But if you take account of the workers who are economically dependent, who are in the supply chain, who are working for subcontractors for which Samsung is like an existentialist client, then the number actually jumped to 1.5 million. So our question is, with globalization, with what we call the fragmentation of businesses, outsourcing and so on, it makes it even more difficult to report on the impact because we don't even know where the company ends. So from there, let me perhaps, this is about measuring and reporting.
If I could interrupt,
yeah.
It's also about your perspective. Sorry, you're posing the question to us, you know, where does the responsibility of the company end? What would be the perspective from a trade union perspective? Where does the responsibility end, basically?
But there are tests about by the employer-employee relationships that you can simply apply them. And you actually have those tests, and the OECD has those tests. They actually, a couple of months ago, agreed on a new set of guidance called the Guidance on Due Diligence. And Sweden has been a supporter of that, and Swedish companies are already applying that. It's the basic principle whereby you actually apply risk management tool to prevent adverse impact. And if you are informed of an adverse impact in the supply chain that is beyond the legal perimeter of the company, do your actually best to try to mitigate those risks. So you have this instrument. Reporting, and unsurprisingly, you know, I'm a union guy here, I'm representing union, where we believe that reporting on collective bargaining, on union density, is something that is affordable. Business can report on that. They do have the risk management tool. They do have the risk reporting tools on that. And then we are trying to focus on well-being, but let me just say perhaps that if business could publicly report on the tax it pays around the world, also report on democracy in the workplace and so on, there are many indicators. Clearly, we have to focus on a limited number of indicators. But the way forward is indeed to focus on the right indicators, I mentioned a few, to focus on the right tools and the due diligence standard by the OECD. I'm not here to make the promotion of it, but I think it's a very good, it's a serious step forward.
Thanks. Now, Young-Kyung. Young-Kyung will be answering the questions in Korean. I would like to ask you also to provide a Korean perspective about how the Chamber of Commerce is actually helping companies to actually increase the well-being agenda under companies.
Thank you. 안녕하세요. 대한상공회의소의 SGI 연구소를 맡고 있는 서윤경 원장입니다. 대한상공회의소는 18만 기업 회원을 가지고 있습니다. 대기업과 중소기업을 다 포괄하고 있고요. 저희가 웰빙과 인클루시브 그로스 관련해서 추진하고 있는 사업이랄까요? 아젠다 두 가지를 소개하고자 합니다. 첫 번째는 기업 혁신 운동이라는 건데요. 대기업으로부터 중소기업으로 기술과 경영의 이전이 이루어지는 것을 저희가 돕는 프로그램입니다. 그러니까 대기업이 그 1차, 2차, 3차 그 협력업체들에게 기술과 그 경영 노하우를 이전할 수 있도록 저희가 중개 역할을 하고 또 사후 평가를 해서 실질적으로 어떤 성과가 났는지 저희가 그 평가를 해서 공개도 합니다. 그래서 이제 삼성이라든가 현대, 포스코 다수의 기업들이 참여를 하고 있고요. 삼성 같은 경우에는 150명 정도의 전담 조직이 있고 현대도 1,300개 정도의 그 하청 기업을 상대로 이제 이런 그 무브먼트에 참여를 하고 있고요. 포스코도 예산이 한 200억 정도 이상 5년 동안 그렇게 투입을 한 것으로 알고 있습니다. 그래서 이렇게 기술 이전이 이루어지면서 그 하청업체로서는 직접적으로 어떤 파이낸스와 기술을 공유받는 그런 효과 이외에 전체적으로 어떤 투자와 고용이 활성화되면서 또 생산성이 높아지면서 그것이 다시 모기업의 생산성을 높이는
그러한 선순환이 이루어지고 있는 것으로 저희가 파악하고 있고요. 그래서 저희가 그 효과 그리고 우수 기업에 대해서 매년 사례를 발표하면서 이러한 그 운동이 좀 활발히 일어날 수 있도록 저희가 지원을 하고 있습니다. 또 하나 저희가 좀 요새 역점을 두고 있는 분야는 기업 문화인데요. 잘 아시겠지만 방금 하버드 그 사무총장님께서도 한국의 근로시간이 52시간도 너무 길다라고 말씀하셨는데 그렇게 긴 근로시간뿐만 아니라 경직적인 기업 문화가 한국에서 아직 자리 잡고 있다고 생각을 합니다. 그 비효율적인 회의 문화라든가 또 경직적인 업무 지시 그런 것이 좀 만연하고 있고요. 그래서 저희가 최근에 그 설문조사를 했더니 업무 지시 관련해서 상사들은 내가 업무 지시를 했는데 도대체 아래 직원들이 알아듣지를 못한다. 열정이 없다. 주인의식이 없다. 이렇게 이제 평가를 하는데 아래 직원들은 정확히 무슨 내용인지 잘 모르겠다. 그리고 책임도 주지 않는다. 책임과 권한을 같이 주지 않는다. 그래서 같은 업무 지시에 대해서도 좀 다른 생각을 하고 있다. 이제 이런 게 파악이 됐고요. 그래서 이것은 이제 소통이 제대로 되지 않는 그러한 기업 문화로 인한 것이다라고 저희는 파악을 하고 있고, 그래서 기업 문화를 개선하는 것이 조직원들의 웰빙을 임프루브하는 것뿐만 아니라 기업의 성과가 나아지는데도 굉장히 어떤 핵심적인 그런 요인이라고 저희는 파악을 하고 있습니다. 그래서 기업 문화, 우수 기업 문화 사례를 저희가 조사를 해서 사례집을 만들어서 배포도 하고 있고 기업 문화가 나아질 수 있도록 저희가 여러 노력을 하고 있습니다. 이 두 가지 내용이 저희 상공회의소가 최근에 노력하고 있는 그러한 아젠다라고 말씀드릴 수 있겠습니다.
Just on the latter point, I think that's something that we've heard today already, that sometimes worker satisfaction is one of the most important ways actually that companies can influence worker well-being. Have there then also been measurements of actually cultures that are more effective? Is it proven that that is affecting sort of the work morale, for example, of the workers?
저희는 아직은 설문조사라든가 이렇게 정성적인 평가만 하고 있고요. 정량적인 평가는 아직 하고 있지 않습니다. 그런데 개별 기업들이 발표하는 사례를 보면 삼성이라든가 현대라든가 그런 것이 이제 기업 문화 개선을 해서 어느 정도의 그 매출과 이익의 개선이 있었다라는 것이 이제 컨설팅 펌과의 그 협력을 통해서 결과를 발표하고 있는데 저희가 정량적으로 매제한 내용은 없습니다.
Okay. Thanks very much. So next, Malin, you've already had quite a long sit over here, and I think we all enjoyed your conversation with Stiglitz. I had many different questions which I wanted to pose to you, but I perhaps also want to challenge a bit, because the impression we got from the conversation with Stiglitz was this ideal company where all the values and it's the Swedish system, it's all great. I want to challenge you on one thing. You're in the corporate reporting section of your company, and within a company there's also all types of power struggles. There will be departments that are very much geared towards your agenda. There will be departments that say, oh, there she is from sustainability again. So I just want to challenge you on that point, and perhaps also ask you the question, if Volvo gave you the right of way to actually choose where in the company you would be positioned, would you be in the innovation, in the strategy, or would you stay exactly where you are now?
First, of course, I would be the CEO of the company.
CEO. Ambition, yeah.
No, actually, thank you very much, and it's really, really relevant. Of course, Volvo Group, we have a lot of challenges as well. I think even though we have been working on these issues for a very long time, actually, we still have a huge journey by really implementing the ethical culture within the company of 100,000 employees. Of course, today I can go to the product development department, talking to my colleagues developing the future trucks, and I say, I want to discuss about sustainability with you, and they say, no, I don't know if we have any sustainability work. And then I try to explain and say that what you do every day is about sustainability. You improve the performance of our products. And they say, no, I work on product development. So we still have a huge journey. So, and we have a lot of challenges. And being in this role for 15 years, I used to say that it's always a change management journey. When I started, like just like we heard before, when I started 15 years back, there was some expectations on companies not to bribe, but it was still not a norm which was included in the UN Global Compact 10 principles. At that time, it was only 9 principles, and the corruption came in 2007 or 6 or something. And now, of course, it's legislation. So coming back to your question, I think why companies are doing this is really that first it starts with expectations on companies from different reasons, from different stakeholders. It could be employees, it could be the government or whatever. And eventually it becomes norms into the OECD framework or the UN frameworks, and eventually legislation. So I think this is also managing and understand the expectations from different stakeholders is about creating long-term value and being long-term successful. And I think this is very much how we from the sustainability area could really contribute to long-term value creation in among the investors. Because today the investor community is not really giving the right ranking, so to say, to sustainability long term. We are still very much in excluding companies who are in tobacco or having child labor and so on. And there is no premiums for, like, oh, you are really a good company, you understand this transition to a more sustainable future. So this is how I view it.
I was just wondering whether you answered my question.
Sorry, what was your question?
Well, would you, for example, like to be head of product development of Volvo?
Aha.
No,
No.
it's
I said
you want to be a CEO.
But yeah.
Or CEO, so you would actually go straight, yeah, that's an
And
answer.
Everything.
Great. I'd like to remind the audience to keep posting your questions. You can also vote on the questions that are already there. And I think there's also somebody who's actually asking a question over there. But before the microphone is to you, I think there's one thing which I'd like to dwell on with Rudolf, is this issue. I think also this morning Jeffrey Sachs was very critical of large multinational firms. And I think there's also a reason there. And there are also firms that are perhaps reporting on sustainable development, and at the same time also lobbying perhaps for legislation that's beneficial to them. And I know that you have an interesting perspective on that issue, so
Yes, I mean, so we said before that actually the different indicators that capture, that are used just to capture the sustainability or the well-being that firms produce are not very convergent. So in a study we did, we took 6 different indicators, and we found that for the same company, if you exclude all the differences in methodologies, etc., so just you compare what is comparable, the correlation is only 38%. So that means that this market, so to speak, is inefficient. So the firms can pick the evaluators, and the evaluators pick the evaluatees. So I think that it would be better if we were moving towards kind of a convergence. So this could be done by some public authorities, or at the international level, or if not, because of the wall that I was telling before, a private company will do. And so we see that since we did the study, some companies, like Thomson Reuters, for instance, are buying some of these evaluators. And so we will have, in the years to come, actually, one player that will be capable of evaluating the top 3,000 MNEs or 4,000 MNEs across a range of indicators. But this will help us to measure CSR. But we know also, and this morning some people gave names of some companies, especially in the oil sector, we know that these companies also lobby against the evolution of legislation and regulation that are here just to try to protect the future and to avoid the actually negative externalities that this industry produce. So at the same time, you could be maybe in these indicators, be well ranked in the CSR, but at the same time, lobbying, in a sense, for some other, for your interest, which is not aligned with the CSR. So in the California Management Review with several scholars from UCLA, Michigan, Harvard, and other schools, we are like, I don't remember, maybe 12 authors, we published an editorial, an article which says moving from CSR to CPR, from corporate social responsibility to corporate political responsibility, in a sense that we would like to have access and just to be more transparent in all the different tactics that firms and multinationals do practice at the parliament levels over the globe, just to really see whether they do walk their talk. In a sense, you could be very high in CSR based on this convergence of indicators, but at the same time fighting for some other interests which will not be aligned, which you can call hypocrisy, or you can call different ways. And I think that this is what is needed.
And would that increase the trust, you think, in large corporations or not?
I think that if you have a pressure, I think that, when you ask a party, like a bank, a pension fund, to invest for you based on your savings or the revenues that you have with certain goals, and that if these companies do not do their duties and do not invest based on the total information that they have, they are fooling you. So that means that you could sue the bankers that will not invest based on the full information that would be available. So I think that the investors will play a big role. I think that the client would have a big role, not buying the products. So of course, if you say oil and most of us need a car, probably just for transportation. The airline industry needs, diesel, and also the ship industry is using this. But I think that if you have CSR, if you have CPR indicators, if you have clearly duties for the investors to invest according to what you want, as a client, as an investor, or I think that progressively, the indicators will align. And I can add also the fact that some companies go with some governance, so meaning some bonus and incentives. I don't know at Volvo if you have this, but for instance, some companies have 15 to 30% of the variable compensation that is related to some of the indicators we just mentioned, aligned with some of the SDGs. I think that progressively you create a space in which firms need to basically align their behavior with their talk.
I think that's also something I'd like to raise with you, Asako. The issue of investors, the role that the financial sector can play in sort of the transitioning of companies and financing companies to do better, basically, on this issue. Would you like to expand on that issue?
Yes, thank you for that. I think the major changes we see in past 10 years is specifically around financial service sector changes. So traditionally, sustainability or whatever we need to address through human rights or supply chain or climate, it has been seen as a company operating within their boundary is the primary thing that company has to do. That's very clear. We have laws and regulations and everything, but I think in the past years we see OECD guideline mentioning about supply chain and human rights. We see the UN guiding principle and business and human rights specifically mentioning about the sphere of influences, which means you don't only be responsible for your own operational boundaries, but if you have an influence over, which means like first-tier, second-tier suppliers, then you'll probably need to be taking care or pay much attention to it. So that sort of idea came. So initially, financial services, whatever form it takes, it could be institutional investors or a banking, they initially thought that they can't really control their client, whatever they do in their mining site, they do a lot of pollution or whatever, they thought they couldn't deal with that. But I think that eventually changed because of a lot of pressures and guidelines and rules change. So that's the major changes for the financial institution in the past 10 years. So when you say financial services, I'm specifically talking about not individual investors. Obviously, like a customer, client, individual investor can also take a strong role, but I haven't seen that yet as much as we would like to see. So it's more about institutional investors. And what we see, it could be bank, or it could be institutional investor, it could be asset owners like pension fund, who basically have a long-term investment view to it. And it could be insurance company like AXA, that sort of, yeah.
Are you already seeing this development?
Yes, absolutely. We're seeing they have changed very dramatically in the past 5 years. So, for example, if I show like United States, many of the companies are seeing short-termism for the corporation. However, we see major asset managers like BlackRock, State Street, private equity company like KKR, they tremendously shifted towards ESG investment. That has changed a lot of landscape to the investment society, and also the banking changed when they do a project finance and loaning to the corporations or major mining site in, finance, and they do a screening on ESG. So I think many of the things has changed through the financial activities.
You wanted to respond?
Just a short comment. Trade unions, we are very much into this area, which is how to ensure that the pension funds, particularly because that's our institutions, pension funds have a social purpose to finance workers' retirement. And so we populate the boardrooms, speaking of boardrooms. Yes, there is a lot of opportunities with responsible investment, but the thing is that the transaction costs are huge because the investment chain, we're talking about the complexity of the supply chain downstream, but the investment chain upstream is also very complex. We, labor movement, we have people on the boardroom of the asset owner, the pension funds. And we think that's, you know, big pension funds handling billions of dollars, they have a lot of leverage. They don't. It's the intermediaries, it's the middleman, the financial middleman, the BlackRock, the fund manager, the asset manager, who for a fee handle the money and have the voting power. And so we talk a lot about the accountability and the reporting downstream supply chain. Much has yet to be achieved upstream in the investment chain. And let me also add just one point is that for the new business models, the startups and the digital giants, this responsible investment does not work. Because if for those large digits you have one founder who, through dual classes of shares, control the company. So you know, these are people, you know, you can put as much leverage campaign. In the end, they are literally the real bosses. Perhaps the same with the rise of state-owned enterprises or state investment funds who are perhaps less familiar. And in general, we have a rise in private equity. We have a fall in listing equity, which obviously makes it a bit more complicated to promote a responsible investment strategy. Or it needs to adapt. I mean, many challenges ahead.
Yeah. Just wanted to add one point about the investor changes. Although I have mentioned there's a huge changes that I see, the area they're looking into is very much limited still. It could be governance, it could be climate, they take a form of divestment or shareholder resolution or engagement. And it could be some sort of diversity on the board for the governance perspective. So the area they look into is very much limited. Those boutique, small size, relatively small and asset boutique SRI investors are much more deeply digging into the multiple dimension of sustainability, including labor, supply chain, and human rights, but that they're still, unfortunately, minor.
Yeah. We have a question from the audience that seems to be resonating really well with the perhaps the South Korean audience. So I hope it can actually pop up on the screen. I think it's something that I'd like Young Kyung Soo to answer. It actually says, on a work-life balance report based on OECD data in 2017, Korea was ranked 35 out of 37 countries. Is there any plan to correct this, to improve this in Korea? Do you have a perspective on this, Young Kyung?
지금 52시간 근무 시간을 도입하는 것만 해도 큰 개선이라고 생각합니다. 지금 현재 한국의 근무 시간이 연평균 2,000시간이 넘는다고 합니다. 이제 그 2,000시간이 넘기 때문에 멕시코나 코스타리카에 이어서 우리가 OECD 국가 중에서 근무 시간이 지금 3위라는 거고요. 52시간만 돼도 상당히 개선이 되는 것이고, 그리고 그 적용되는 300인 이상 기업뿐만 아니라 전반적인 다른 기업으로도 그것이 파급이 되면서 불필요한 어떤 야근이 많이 줄어들 거라고 생각이 들고요. 그리고 워크라이프 밸런스를 맞추기 위해서 여러 가지 젠더 간의 어떤 균형 이슈, 이런 것도 지금 굉장히 사회 이슈가 되고 있고요. 그래서 조금씩 그 기업과 정부가 함께 노력하기 때문에 한국에서도 그 변화가 이루어지지 않을까 생각을 합니다.
That's an interesting answer, and I think it's also curious that you are sitting next to each other. I think, Malin, you were a bit surprised when you heard that it was a reduction to a 52-hour work week. So perhaps the Swedish perspective would also be interesting in terms of work-life balance.
Yes, from time to time, I think, unfortunately, the discussion or the pendulum has turned in the wrong direction, actually, in Sweden. Not many Swedes are working 52 hours, but I think it's probably less and less, I would say. And as I mentioned before, I think you have to understand both, of course, the Korean way and the Swedish way is not perfect, because in Sweden, it has become a tendency of saying, okay, I have time to go to work today, so I will show up. Maybe I work from home. Yeah. And I mean, I think this is a general problem both in the Swedish society but also on the workplaces, because I think we have to look upon this kind of, if you want to be a part of a company, you have some obligations and you have some rights, and the same goes if you are a member of a society. In Sweden, we talk very much about the rights you have as an employee or a citizen and how the society will take care of you. But we have forgot to talk about that if you want to be a part of the society, you also have obligations. And I think so probably somewhere in between Korea and Sweden is a good is a good thing.
Marie, could I ask you, is work-life balance actually also something that is relevant at the SME level? I could imagine that there's actually also quite a lot of hard work in SMEs and that it can become a problem at that level as well.
Well, I think you have different types of SMEs, you know. You have those SMEs that, you know, those economic units that they have their little enterprise or informal unit just to survive, to make a living. And then you have SMEs that are more, you know, the gazelles or the... So one could say in life in general, work-life balance is important. And I think we would all be better off if we collectively, globally, would believe that. Now, there used to be a time where if you didn't answer an email within 24 hours, you were completely rude, you know. So we are all, yesterday there was a discussion on we all being more connected, but at the same time, there's this overload. So I think it affects everybody. At the same time, when you're doing, you know, entrepreneurs, whether they're very small or medium-sized, when you're doing something that you're passionate about, sometimes, you know, so you are happy. Therefore, even if you spend more time, not necessarily, you might spend more than 52 hours a week as a small entrepreneur, no, somewhere. But you don't feel the burden. So I think one has to be also flexible in terms of how we see this. But I would say, and now me as a professional, I would certainly say that work-life balance, obviously, is something that we should all aspire to, and particularly women, whether you are in business, government, or, you know, it's more challenging for lots of reasons. We're not here to discuss that, but.
Well, we have 5 minutes left, and there's a definite sort of question from the audience that's topping the list. It is actually multi-interpretable, so I think we should put it up on the screen. We speak sometimes about well-being as an ancillary lens which needs to be incorporated into business lens or management paradigm. How do we make well-being directly profitable as a business idea or industry unique value proposition? Now, I'm having several thoughts when I'm reading this. It's not entirely, there's several ways I think in which you could answer this. Is there anyone on the panel who would like to reflect? It's a very, it did resonate in the audience, but as I said, there might be several ways of answering this question. Is there anyone who would like to take a stab at this?
I can go. Well, I mean, obviously I have the trade union angle to that. There's a limit to the entire story of the business case. You know, we firmly believe that a company is made of different stakeholders, and that, like not like a family, sorry, but things has to be negotiated. Well-being, work-life balance, in the end, it should be the outcome of a democratic conversation and sometimes confronting views between the stakeholders and between workers and management. Let me just finish and perhaps the indicators of work-life balance, of well-being within the company are not necessarily too good across the OECD. There is, frankly, a rise in the number of burnouts, for example. I don't want to here to dramatize the situation, but burnout is a general phenomenon. Work pressure is an issue. One way to address this is indeed perhaps with flexible working time. Also, as you mentioned, perhaps to address the gender balance, or to redress the gender balance for women to compensate more, to combine two. And so for us, part of the story is with indeed more democracy in the workplace. It's not more regulation, but regulation by definition is a good thing if it's quality regulation, not stupid regulation. If it's allowed for a good negotiation within the firm and to redress the inherently imbalanced bargain of power between employer and workers.
Malin, would you like to take us, we have only a couple more minutes,
Yes.
Would you like to take us on a high note to coffee?
No, I just wanted to comment on this one as well, and I think first, as we said before, the reason behind working with well-being is, of course, increased productivity, and I think that is, of course, the business rationale, but I would also like to add another business rationale, and that is that if we have high trust among employees and management or within a society, the transaction costs are actually less. And I think this is one of the explanations why, like, countries with a high level of trust was better off in the last financial crisis. So the other business rationales for working on work-life balance is, of course, that it's less cost. And I mean, with two business rationales, why shouldn't business do this? Of course, there is this ethical thing and responsibility thing as well, but I mean, the business rationales, that's what we talked about yesterday, that it has to be that the companies like evidence. And this is the evidence. This is what we should work on.
Great, thanks. Well, time flies. We're already at the end of our session. I'm sorry we've run out of time. Could we all thank our panelists for their excellent contributions?
And also to our moderator as well. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, please give them another big round of applause. Thank you.